Chapter 17. Time went by. Halloween, Thanksgiving, Christmas, Valentine's Day. Flora and I were doing well at the piano, practicing with a fair amount of regularity, and taking lessons every week. Then, one day between Valentine's and Easter, we were faced with a new mystery, which ultimately became known as the fur scarf mystery. The disturbing part was that it seemed to implicated Mrs. Music Lady. The scarf was a Christmas gift from the relatives in Wisconsin. As Flora said, it's the only decent present they've ever sent. I agreed. The Christmas box from our Wisconsin relatives had always been predictable. 5 plainly wrapped packages with no name tags. The first package, long and skinny, was always Papa's new tie. The next package was always Mama's new scissors. Then came the 3 identical packages, always soft and squishy, never hard or rattling. We didn't fight over them, as one might expect. We knew that whatever they were, they wouldn't fit. At least they wouldn't fit Flora or me. For several years they sent us wool mittens that were all Dorothy's size. She had a change of mittens for every day of the week, while Flora and I were left out in the cold, so to speak. Sometimes they sent handkerchiefs, which was better, because we didn't have to figure out whose nose they fit. That Christmas, however, the 3 packages contained furs and a note about Flora almost being a teenager. They were shaped like a collar, with taffeta ribbons to be tied under the chin. Each one was a different type of fur and a different color, and since they had no name tags, we had to fight over them. As could be expected, Flora got first choice, a blonde fur with gold ribbons. I got second choice, but, as always happened, Dor screamed until she got second choice. She chose the one that looked like a nice woolly sheep. I got the leftover. It looked like the McNabb's Airedale dog. Flora loved her scarf and wore it every day. Dor wore hers almost as often. I seldom wore mine because, as I said, I'm afraid that Dunny will catch me and put me in his doghouse. One day Flora came home sick with anguish, announcing that her fur was missing. We couldn't believe it because, as Papa had said, she never takes it off. Flora explained that she had taken it off at our music teacher's house, but when she was preparing to come home, she couldn't find it. Papa suggested, maybe you lost it on the way home. But Flora was certain. It was warm in there, so I took it off and put it by my coat, and when I went for it after my piano lesson, it wasn't there. Mama called our music teacher immediately. A search was begun to no avail. Mama, of course, phoned Mrs. Williams, who dashed right over. Certainly she is honest, Mama said of our music teacher, motioning for me to go on practicing, which was what I had been doing anyway. Of course she's honest, Mrs. Williams said. Besides, what use would she have for a child's fur scarf? Yet she claimed she had no pupils after Florence. I had been listening with one ear, and suggested that perhaps the cat had dragged it outside. Mama went to the phone and came back with the news that the cat had died on Valentine's Day. Well, that only leaves one person, Mrs. Williams said. Who would that be? Mama asked. She was standing by the piano, listening to me play. Mrs. Williams said with a note of certainty, it had to be. I missed what she said, because my music had directed me to play double forte. I always relished an opportunity to play double forte. When I was back to playing medium loud, I heard Mama say, but what would he do with it? Mrs. Williams didn't have an answer. Flora was heartbroken. I told her that she could wear my fur scar. She said she was afraid Dunny would catch her and put her in the doghouse. Sadly, her piano playing took a turn for the worst, but I didn't let it bother me. The fact is, I was doing wonderfully well. Unfortunately, fate soon stepped in and changed all of that. I was playing my lesson one day when suddenly I received a terrible shock. Vibrations shot up and down my spine. I shook my head to make sure it was still on. Everything had gone as usual up to that point. I had been happily playing 3 Blind Mice, or maybe it was the opening bars of Beethoven's Fur Elise. I had heard the neighbor lady come in, and later the books had been thrown on the table, followed by a scratchy voice saying, "Hi, Mom, can I go to Pete's house?" Then I heard Mrs. Music Lady's response, but it was not the sweet voice I was accustomed to. Instead, her voice had a touch of exasperation, an indication of what I already suspected. She was touchy from having been a suspect in the fur scarf mystery. She said the name that I had repeated 500,000 times from the treetops. Albert Benfield, you cannot. It was suddenly clear. All these months I had been listening to the voice of the one-armed Albert Benfield. Our teacher was not Mrs. Music Lady. She was Mrs. Benfield. I was too frightened to turn around, so I continued to play. On and on I played. I took the repeats 6 times, including introductions and codas. Why, in all the time from Halloween to Easter, hadn't I recognized the scratchy voice? Maybe the acoustics of the Benfield living room were different than those of our playground. Finally, Mrs. Music Lady tiptoed up and told me that my lesson was over. Not 1 minute of the time I spent at the Benfield house after that was free from the thought of having an encounter with the one-armed Albert. I was never able to settle down to the business of learning piano. I spent the time crouched over the keyboard, my nose butted up to the music rack. I took to wearing Mama's old scarves and hats. I even took Papa's old umbrella, rain or shine, to disguise my entrances and exits. All night long I had nightmares about Albert appearing, dripping blood from his arm. I know who plays the piano at my house at 3:06 every Thursday afternoon. Finally, Memorial Day came. Papa was puzzled by our lack of progress. He figured that if he paid $16 a month when he gave the command, "Come play for our guests," we should be able to play something. He set his glasses halfway down his nose and stared at us over the top. "What in the world do you do at that teacher's house?" We were suddenly absorbed in dislodging hangnails. It was difficult to explain, so we didn't try. Papa told Mama, "They aren't playing worth a hill of beans, so let them take the summer off." Dor, as usual, came along and upset the apple cart. She decided that she wanted to take lessons. Papa felt that Dor was his last hope, so he agreed that she could start and that I should continue because, after all, Dor was my responsibility. I wasn't so sure about Papa's hopes. I rated Dor's musical talents on par with Mama's. However, I figured that if I told Papa he was wasting his money, he'd put his glasses halfway down his nose and say, "Who are you to talk?" Dor raced through her music like everything else she did. She loved having me play her pieces with her. She would set the tempo, and I would follow. After all, it was her piece. Everything went fine until the last few notes. Then she would break tempo and speed for the finish. "I can beat Franny." Then came the accident that was to dash Papa's hopes forever. We were spending the weekend with Papa's attorney friend and his family in their big log house on Puget Sound. Papa said of Steve Carey, his attorney friend, that he was a crackerjack in the courtroom, but he questioned his abilities when it came to raising 3 sons and a daughter. The 3 boys were as wild as a buffalo herd. When they weren't screeching around outdoors, popping firecrackers or swinging axes, they were hanging from the log beams and jumping from one Davenport to the other. Papa didn't know if they were so wild when girls weren't around, but from their mother's exhausted state, he suspected they were. We had been playing hide-and-seek that day, and everything had been relatively sane, until Dor dashed in and touched her hand to the chopping block. "Home free!" At that instant I saw the axe crashing down from above. I heard Dor scream, and then Joe dashed for the house, yelling at the top of his lungs, "Ma, I cut off her finger!" Everyone came running. Papa scooped up Dor and started for the car. "We've got to get her to the doctor." I started running too, right beside Mama and Flor, when suddenly I remember the finger. I ran to the chopping block and began to search amongst the wood chips, but nary a piece of skin or bone could I find, only blood. When I turned back, our car was headed down the gravel road. I ran after it screaming, but the car disappeared in a cloud of dust. Finally, Mrs. Carey came and led me back to the house. I sank down on the Davenport with the broken springs. Headlines ran through my brain. Dorothy Bigham died today because all her blood ran out. I thought about losing Dor. She was the most important person in my life, the one I shared my secrets with. At times I almost hated her. She was always getting me into trouble, always trying to beat me, but I couldn't live without her. I spent the terrible day inconsolable, sobbing over and over. Dor is dead. I couldn't eat. I couldn't drink. Added to my grief was the terror of being abandoned on an island in the middle of Puget Sound. Mama and Papa had forgotten about me. They would never even remember where they left me. It brought back a memory that had haunted me from the time I was 5. We had been dressed in our best clothes, ready to go out to dinner. Suddenly, in my excitement, I had wet my bloomers. When Mama and Papa discovered my dilemma, they were extremely exasperated. "If you can't learn to go to the bathroom, we don't want you in the family." With that, they turned off the light and marched out the door. I stood there at the bottom of the dark stairway, absolutely terrified, cold and miserable, completely abandoned. When they returned, maybe an hour later, I was still in the same spot. Late that afternoon, Mr. Carey announced that he was driving me home. I was greatly relieved, but the long drive and ferry ride with a man who was almost a stranger continued my terror. I entered the house with a mixture of joy and dread. Mama assured me that Dor was still alive, but very hurt. I went to her bed. She lay there still, her arm in a huge bandage. I began to cry anew. I went back to get your finger, but I couldn't find it. Dor didn't even open her eyes. Mama explained that her finger had been held with just the tiniest thread of skin. The doctor didn't have much hope, but he sewed it back on and warned Mama that Dor's hand must be kept constantly warm. He warned about infection that could cause the loss of the finger, and even Dor's life. Mama was tireless in her effort. She devised a sling that held 2 hot water bottles, which Dor wore all the time. When we went to the doctor, Mama filled big thermoses and changed the water bottles en route. Finally, Dor's finger was saved. However, it was stiff and stuck straight out from her hand, so she always appeared to be pouring tea at a garden party. Of course, her piano-playing days were over, but she discovered that she could still play the ukulele. She practiced her froggy song, and the day finally arrived when she was to make her debut as a soloist. Papa fixed the strings on her ukulele so they were in top shape, and reminded her to strum quietly. "Remember, you can't overpower your voice with the accompaniment," he told her. The event had been well publicized. King Hubert Godfrey announced on previous broadcasts that Little Duddlebug, the smallest fairy in the whole of Storyland Court, would be singing a special song. Mama had told Mrs. Williams, who of course told the whole neighborhood. Papa told Mac and the lawyers at his office building. Mama had gone to great lengths to get Duddlebug ready. Even her attire had been carefully chosen. Although we customarily wore school clothes to the studio, Mama thought that, for her debut, Dor should wear the costume, black velvet with white fur trim, which had worked miracles for her confidence in ice skating. We were surprised that Mama's creation did so much for her confidence, even if it did little for her skating. As little Duddlebug stood up to the hubcap, it seemed that the costume had been a good choice. She looked confident. I was the one who was nervous. But why? What could possibly go wrong? Duddlebug began her song. "Once there was a froggy." She looked at me for support. I was filled with pride. Even with all of her other coaches, she considered me the real expert. And why not? It had been scientifically proven that I was both genetically and environmentally endowed. "Living in a brook," she continued, looking at me. What happened next, I can't explain, except that maybe I thought, since Dor was seeking advice, it was absolutely imperative that I give some. Instead of bestowing a sweet smile of approval, as everyone else was doing, I gave her a look of desperation and began signaling for more volume. Dor responded. I could see her diaphragm expanding greatly, and I saw the exhale begin, but very little was coming out. I signaled again. Dor braced herself and began banging furiously on her ukulele. Unfortunately, nobody in the charmed land learned what happened to the frog. Not until the next month, that is, when Duddlebug repeated her song. Whether by popular demand or not, I'm not sure, but I rather suspect not. On that occasion, the royalty of Storyland Court were taking no chances. They relegated me to a back seat, completely out of Duddlebug's range of vision. This time, Duddlebug managed to get through the song without any mishaps, although I think that all the experts agreed that she was not genetically endowed. Fleur explained, she's an environmentalist.